Hi again, K-Clubbers. Let's start week 9. So today's topics are the protection of human subjects from research risk, which is a huge section to write, inclusion of women and minorities, inclusion of individuals across the lifespan, and then we're going to revisit the inclusion enrollment report and homework. So almost done with career, and we're going to check off a few more bullet points from research today. First, before we get into the protection of human subjects, who is a human subject? It's a living individual about whom an investigator is conducting research. So you're obtaining information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, or you're using, studying, or analyzing this info from biospecimens. So ET is not included as a human subject. So you're obtaining, using, studying, analyzing, or generating identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So important to note, if you're doing secondary data analysis only and have no access to subjects' identifiable private information, talk to your primary mentor ASAP about whether your de-identified data qualifies as non-human subjects research. If your mentor agrees that it is non-human subjects research, so it doesn't qualify as human subjects research, you have to submit a document explaining how, if the project involves human specimens or data, the project is consistent with the criteria of non-human subjects research. So this extra document is not included in my table of all the documents you need for your K. So this is a separate document. So you want to work with your primary mentor and potential IRB review board grants person to write this. So if you're doing any new data collection with individuals, you definitely are doing human subjects research, and you are not exempt from writing the protection of human subjects section in your grant. Next up, we're going to talk about what a clinical trial is. There are a wide range of clinical trials being done in terms of getting NIH funding. So does your study involve human participants? Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of an intervention on participants? And is the effect being evaluated a health-related, biomedical, or behavioral outcome? If yes to all these 4 questions, then you have to fill out more paperwork than non-clinical trials research has to. And in terms of a clinical trial definition and deciding whether or not your study is a clinical trial, you want to go to grants.nih.gov and look at this link. So if you are doing human subjects research, you need to fill out protection of human subjects from research risk. And this section covers 3 basic ethical principles. So you will have learned, I'm sure, from online study training that you've done probably yearly since you started doing research, that you need to respect for subjects, persons participating in your studies. You need to provide informed consent, and each person needs to voluntarily consent to be a part of your study. And you need to provide privacy for their personal identifiable information. In terms of beneficence, you need to minimize risk. You need to ensure confidentiality of all of the data you're collecting, and you need to monitor their data for safety. Third, you should enable justice for participants who are vulnerable. So you should provide subject selection equality, protect vulnerable populations, and reduce populations of convenience. So this protection of human subjects from research risk has no page limit, which is good because it can be, I'd say, at least over 10 pages to write. There's an NIH podcast asking the question, am I doing human subjects research? I recommend that you listen to this podcast and confirm that you are indeed doing human subjects research. Again, if you're studying ALF or MORC of Mork and Mindy fame, obviously you're not doing human subjects research. But if you are proposing to involve human subjects, you must address risk to these subjects, the adequacy of your protections against this risk, potential benefits of the research to subjects and others, the importance of the knowledge to be gained for your project, and a data and safety monitoring plan for your study. We're going to tackle these sections individually. Risks to human subjects. So you want to describe the following in this section, and reviewers will be checking off all of these to make sure that you covered them. So describe and justify proposed involvement in human subjects, the characteristics of the subject population, so the number of subjects, age range, and health status, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you're going to detail all this information. The rationale for involvement of vulnerable populations, if applicable, so fetuses, pregnant women, children, prisoners, institutionalized individuals, or others, and the role of the collaborating sites where research will be performed. So if you're only doing research within your university, you're just going to say that where you're doing the research. But if it involves multiple sites, you need to make clear what those sites are. You want to describe and justify research procedures, including dosage, frequency, etc., of any interventions, and describe what research material, data, and information will be collected from these subjects. Here you go into as much detail as possible. You want to talk about access to personally identifiable information, how it will be collected and retained, who will have access to it, and the management and protection of materials and information. So how will this human subject info be protected? How will it be confidential and private? You want to detail all potential risks to subjects, physical, psychological, financial, legal, or other, including likelihood and seriousness of these risks. And then you want to describe any alternative treatments or procedures that you will provide to subjects to mitigate any sort of risks. The second section, you're going to describe how you're going to protect against the risk that you outlined in section 1. So you're going to talk about data privacy, confidentiality, informed consent. So you're going to explain the following: how subjects will be recruited, description of the informed consent process for your study, the waiver for any elements of consent that you need to provide, and how the risks described previously, including privacy and confidentiality, will be minimized. You want to describe any additional protections for vulnerable populations. So you want to make sure all this is covered. And last but not least, you want to ensure necessary medical and professional intervention for adverse events. So do you have a physician on call? Do you have a nurse on call? Do you have a clinical psychologist on call in case anyone is suicidal or experiencing a psychotic break if you're working with patients? The third section involves potential benefits of the research to subjects and others. So describing how potential risks to subjects appear reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. So this might involve some thinking on your part. Reach out to your mentorship team for ideas. The fourth section is importance of the knowledge to be gained. So describe how potential risks to subjects appear reasonable in relation to the importance of the knowledge that may result from the study. So what knowledge from your study may outweigh potential risks to subjects? The fifth section is a data and safety monitoring plan. So you want to describe a monitoring plan. Who will be responsible for monitoring and the process by which adverse events and unanticipated problems will be reported to all relevant regulatory bodies. For clinical trials, you need to have a very detailed plan set up. For non-clinical trials, you still need to have this section, but it may not be as detailed. So This entire document, the protection of human subjects from research risk, will be the basis of your human subjects proposal that you submit to your university or institute's Institutional Review Board, or IRB, after you get reviewer feedback on your K application. So even though the section may take a while to draft now, it can be about 10 to 20 pages long. It will come in handy when you're ready to submit your study proposal to the IRB. Let's transition now to a separate section, inclusion of women and minorities. So this is typically less than a page long, but in this section, you're explaining your reasoning for including or excluding biological sex or gender, predominantly biological sex. So what's your rationale for including or excluding males and females? What's your rationale for including or excluding ethnic categories, so Hispanics versus non-Hispanics? And then what's your rationale for including or excluding various racial categories? So American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, Black or African American, white, or more than one race. Here's the content you need to include for this section. This is what reviewers will be checking off. Inclusion on the basis of sex, gender, and race ethnicity. So that's the first heading. Your planned distribution of subjects, the description and rationale of your subject selection, the rationale for exclusion, and the description of outreach programs for recruitment. So, for example, if you're proposing to collect sex and race ethnicity data that broadly resembles the city or town where you're recruiting from, you need to outline all of this in this section. There's additional requirements for clinical trials that I'm not going to get into, and then the evaluation of inclusion across the lifespan will be a separate actual document. So for planned distribution of subjects, if you're collecting new data, provide a description of your plans for including individuals in your study on the basis of sex and race ethnicity. If you are using pre-existing data, say for your K99, is there a description of the planned distribution of subjects regarding these variables? Is there an explanation if the composition is unknown? And is there a description of these variables for the population base of the existing data set if known? For a description and rationale subject selection, you want to describe your subject selection criteria and your rationale for selection considering the population at risk for the disease or condition under study, the scientific objectives, and your proposed study design. So an example for this might be, say you're studying major depressive disorder. Are there data showing that there are sex or racial ethnicity differences in who is diagnosed with MDD? Any of that sort of stuff that might affect who you recruit for your study needs to be explained here. So rationale for exclusion. If the proposed sample specifically excludes a group of risk for the disease or condition under study, you need to provide a justification for your rationale. You could provide citations on the lack of differences on the basis of sex or race and ethnicity. You could explain the need to fill a particular research gap. You could explain you're using pre-existing data or samples when more representative data or samples are not available for your secondary data analysis. And then you're going to describe how you're going to do community outreach for your for study recruitment. So describe recruitment and outreach plans or other methods for enrolling individuals proposed as part of the sample. If your entire grant is secondary data analysis, then you don't need to include this section. So there's additional requirements for clinical trials. If it isn't applicable for your grant, you can put not applicable. But valid analyses may be described as stratified analyses that explore how well the intervention works among sex, gender, and racial ethnic groups. And depending on the current knowledge of whatever disease or condition you're studying, the analyses may need to be adequately powered to detect differences in individual subgroups. So this is all for clinical trials. You should address whether you plan to test or not test for differences involving sex and gender, racial and or ethnic groups, and why that is or is not appropriate. So a particular example could be if you're doing a clinical trial for anorexia nervosa and women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with the disorder, how you're not going to test these differences in your intervention in men or study men. So you can include supporting evidence and or data derived from animal studies, clinical observations, metabolic studies, genetic studies, and pharmacology studies, as well as various other types of studies to support your argument. You may include planned primary and secondary outcomes and whether there are previous studies that support or negate the likelihood of differences between all the different groups. So between sexes, between races and ethnicities. So there are additional requirements for clinical trials that are targeting diversity. I'm not going to get into them here, but you can Google this and find more stuff online. Another section that you will be including is inclusion of individuals across the lifespan, and this is less than a page. So you're going to describe and give a rationale of the age ranges of individuals expected to be recruited for your study. So if you're doing new data collection, you want to describe and give a rationale of the age ranges. If you're doing secondary data analysis, you want to explain list the age ranges and explain, the rationale, if you can find one, of why certain ages were included versus excluded. Then you're going to describe and justify the exclusion of individuals based on age. So below are valid reasons for exclusion. So the disease or condition does not occur in the excluded age range group, or the research topic is not relevant to that age group. So an example of this would be a study of Alzheimer's disease proposes to exclude children. That makes sense because kids are not diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It could be that the knowledge being sought in your research is already available for the excluded age group or will be obtained from another ongoing study, and an additional study would be redundant. So an example of this is a drug studied and approved for use in children will now be studied only in adults. Another example of justification for excluding people based on age is that a separate age-specific study in the excluded age group is warranted and preferable. While this situation may represent a justification for excluding individuals based on age, consideration should be given to taking age differences into account in the study design whenever it is feasible. So an example of this would be a clinical trial designed to promote self-monitoring of blood glucose levels in adolescents with type 1 diabetes proposes to include only adolescents. Okay, here comes the secondary data analysis situation. So if your study will collect or analyze data on pre-enrolled study participants, so longitudinal follow-up studies that did not include data on children or analysis of an existing data set, and data inclusive of individuals across the lifespan are not available to address the scientific question. So you just need to explain what the age range is for this secondary data analysis project and explain that you don't have data across the lifespan. So example, a study which began prior to implementation of the NIH policy proposes to follow up long-term outcomes of individuals with a condition, but the original study excluded children. So similar data are not available from a cohort that includes children. So that's why you're doing secondary data analysis on this particular sample. So there may be laws or regulations barring the inclusion of individuals in a specific age group for certain kinds of research, maybe drug trials or other types of work. For example, regulations for protection of human subjects allow consenting adults to accept a higher level of risk than are permitted for children. It could be that you justify excluding certain people because your study poses an unacceptable risk to the excluded group, such that their participation would not be considered ethical by the local IRB, peer review, and or NIH staff. So an example of this would be, children are excluded from a phase 1 study for a treatment that includes significant risk, including death. Evidence suggests the potential benefits to children do not outweigh the risks. So here you need to justify your age range. Then you want to describe the expertise of the investigative team for working with individuals of the included age groups. Describe the facilities available to accommodate children and older adults if it's applicable to your study. Inclusion of an appropriate distribution of children and older adults to contribute to a meaningful analysis relative to the purpose of the study, if applicable. So if you're doing a study across the lifespan, but you're only including 10% of your sample being older adults, how is that going to work to be able to test a certain effect in older adults? So you saw this inclusion enrollment report last week. This week, you're going to fill in all of the cells, and you should be able to do it at this point after writing the other previous sections. So do an NIH search to find the most recent version of this form. So SF424 forms, if that's where your FOA tells you to look for forms. And make sure the numbers and percentages in each group matches what you wrote in the inclusion of women, minorities, and children section. Make sure that your total number of subjects matches what you say you will recruit in other places in your application, like your approach, specific aims. Budget. So complete the drafts of the following and send to your primary mentor. Protection of human subjects from research risk, inclusion of women and minorities, inclusion of individuals across the lifespan, and the inclusion enrollment report. Revisit what outstanding sections still need feedback from your co-mentors and/or consultants, collaborators, or contributors. See you next week.